So now we have Eric Broadley has designed the Ford GT. Do you have something to say about that?
We have part 2 of the slides. Well, Alan, I'm so glad that you were able to have the foresight to grab this car before it went off. So many of them were just abused and lost at the time. It's such a wonderful color and color combination, and it's just a beautiful car. The 4 engineers ended up over at Lola's shop, and they started to design this car. And they had done the chassis design. Ford engineers liked sheet metal, right? They wanted to have a monocoque for strength and stability. They wanted to have a very stiff chassis. And so, but the design came from styling. But this was, as Janis was talking about, this is the moment in time when Aerodynamics was starting to, they were starting to push into the wall of aerodynamics. It just goes, the drag goes like this. And so they had designed this car with a 280 or 256 Indy motor, and it had enough horsepower to hit 210 miles an hour in theory. And so they wanted to have a car that was strong, but with a shape that the styling had come up with. So they had taken this 3/8 scale model and went into the Maryland wind tunnel, but they could only get up to like 150 miles an hour, and of course it's a smaller version. So they got lift and drag figures. Meanwhile, over at Lola, they were taking the Indy motor and a Colati transmission, and yours is all steel.
Correct.
And this is the number 1 race car, or?
Probably the number 2 or 3 car. Number 2 car.
And so it had some aluminum panels on it.
Right.
It did have, Eric wanted to have the gas tank it would just seal and fuel would be put into the void. But during testing, they were having problems with the body moving and
in order, again, I restored the car exactly the way it appeared at the London Racing Car Show in January 1963. And it had the gas filler on the front fender. But then they realized in order the front fender, you can see the front half raises up. Well, they couldn't have a hose that would stretch that way, so they realized that didn't work. So when I bought it, it actually had an aluminum piece over the top of it. And it actually paints it over. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yep, we're back.
Yeah. And so they realized that, over here. And again, at the London Racing Car Show, it was the star of the show. You can see that this is the gas filler cap. And then they realized that in order to open up the front hood, they wouldn't be able to get the gas down into the tanks, and the tanks are on each side, on each of the pontoons. And so they basically moved it back to the back there. And so consequently, since I restored it basically the way it was at the London Racing Car Show, I took that aluminum piece off and put this on here. But it's interesting, this car, it's got magnesium wheels. The Ford GT ended up with Brony wire wheels, which I think was a step backwards, and I think Ford realized that. And so consequently, they ended up, when they sent the cars to Shelby. And Shelby, the first thing he did was take off the wire wheels and put on Hala brand mag wheels. You take the body off this car and the body off this car, it takes somebody that really knows what they're doing to tell the difference, because they are so similar.
They are so similar. But if you go to, Andrew, if you go to the next slide there. This is the body shape that they, after the Maryland testing, this is in October. They had a new body and they sent this over to England at Lola. And this is what the fiberglass molds for the predecessor to this were made off of. And then here's the mule, the second one. And they did take, they made new suspension pieces and they were able to adapt it to that. And that car still has the Ford suspension on it. Even though it, not this one, but the, huh? Oh, that one does too? Well, Lola had some.
Yeah.
Are these the Lola suspension or the Ford ones?
Well, I think Lola made them, but it was actually the Ford design.
It was the Ford design. Okay, so that was it's a semi-mule.
Yeah.
And so there's Eric Broadley and John Wire in front of the Slough plant. Next. The chassis were built at Abbey Panels, and you know, unless somebody out there knows where they are, because we don't have any photographs inside Abbey Panels. There's one video that one of the engineers took, and so I took some stills of it. They're not very good, but these are the only pictures I've been able to see of inside Abbey Panels making the chassis. You can see the early one on the right there. And so Abbey Panels made the chassis, and over at Slough, next slide, they started to put together the first one, and then as it was assembled, keep going, the scramble this was about late March, early April. They were getting ready to show the car for the world premiere. Next slide. And when it was done, next slide, they took it out, did the press release, and the Ford of UK called it the GT200. They were going to call the sports car GT180. But then they flew this over to New York. Next slide. There's Chuck Mountain, who was on the Mustang 1 team and on the GT program, and he lived at Carcraft all the way through 70. And here's a picture with Roy Lund and John Wire at Gotham Ford. And then at the Essex House, they had Iacocca's, he was happy with it at the Essex House. And again, Ford, in their mind, everything started from the Mustang 1. And it was just a lucky coincidence that Lola had already taken the first step. And I guess the last slide. Eric Broadley, just to show how different the Lola is from this, is that he said when the initial deal was made, I was going to control the design and the engineering, but Roy Lund politicked it away from me. Lund decided he wanted a steel monocoque where the Mark VI was aluminum. Then they designed the body for the car with no discussion with me, to send it over to us. High nose, low tail, hopeless. The aerodynamic problems finally got through to them, but they did something about it, but it wasted so much valuable time. The point of what I'm all going to say is that the interchangeable parts from this car to this car are the metallastic couplings and some nuts and bolts. But everything else about this car is completely different, and no parts other than the motor and the transmission at the time would be interchangeable with the Lola. So it's a completely different car. And it started with the Mustang 1 in Ford's mind, and the project follows the money, and Ford went that way. So it's been very interesting over the last 40 years to listen to what came, this obviously came first. But what was the genesis and what was the design of the GT40? It came from Ford and Dearborn.
You're in front, Rick. You're in front of the front.
Keep in mind, they hired Eric Broadley. And Eric Broadley stayed with them for over a year. And I think it was in July of '64 that they finally split. Well, for the GT40, I mean, it went to New York Auto Show in April. But Eric Broadley, like I say, except for the body design, he was intimately involved with, you know, everything involved. Basically, bottom line, this is kind of the prototype, and it's, I gotta give Ford credit. I mean, they were able to, you know, improve it and modify it, and they did a tremendous job.
I think one thing
This
is
is
also,
Ford versus Lola.
I think one thing that's interesting is the Lola GT did race at Le Mans in 1963, and I don't think that they ever found a need to put a spoiler on the back or wings on the front or anything. But the aero shape of that car, almost right out of the box, was spot on, which addresses you know, Broadway's comment. You know, when he looked at the shape of this, he said, "Oh my God, you know, they've got problems they don't even know about." Yeah. So you know, he definitely was a genius. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Now, wasn't his daughter supposed to be here?
No, but she's on my Glory Days Facebook group. And by the way, none of you are members yet. Glory Days of Racing on Facebook. We've got almost over 32,000 members now. I'm sure many of you are part of it, but please go up and look at it. We've got people like Eric Broadley's daughter and many other people who raced in the day up there. Yeah, now we've talked about that, let's go into the next section, talking about after the Mark I.
And if I can comment just here for a second.
Yeah.
That on this, the issue you just brought up, Harry, that Eric intuitively saw what was going on. Again, going back to this aerodynamic issue, when you're running in this series, the World Championship, there are a number of different circuits. And the big ones were always Sebring, Le Mans, Nürburgring, Targa Florio. But there were others in there, Nürburgring, Monza 1,000 kilometer, a few other races that were big. The thing about this is all these circuits have very, very different characteristics. Le Mans is predominantly high speed. There's one very sharp, slow corner, but the rest of the circuit is predominantly high speed. And what do you want there? You want a low drag coefficient. You want to be as efficient as possible going through the air. Other circuits with lots of corners, slower circuits, what you want is good downforce. And downforce is something that's become much more sophisticated since these days. But you already see that. That's what you see here in the development we're going to see in a minute here, is a little bit more emphasis on downforce and the understanding of downforce. Broadly understood that someplace is one, someplace the other is important. Another aspect here that, of course, we're seeing the difference between these cars and anything that went before. These are mid-engine cars. And interestingly, although Ferrari was dominant until this period, their dominance was really back in the front engine days. They had a tough time making the transition to rear engine. They were very conservative, and that came back to bite them. And that was very forward thinking in terms of the design people here, whether they were talking to Broadley or to Colin Chapman or to John Cooper, that knowledge that really the future lies with mid-engine cars, weight distribution is moving to the back. There was another advances taking place. And Ferrari was interestingly kind of slow. They certainly went into it by the time they went into it with a vengeance, but they were slow to the game.
So in the '64, the first year that the Mark I was racing, it was strikingly beautiful and amazingly fast. Didn't have the reliability at the time. They kept making improvements in the aerodynamics, the ducktail spoiler, the Len Bailey front end. But back in America, Roy Lund had basically, with Chuck Mountain, they had gone to Lola and they had designed the GT40. Now it was up to Wire to build 50 of them. And he came back and started the next level. Roy was always working on the next car for the next year. So if the next slide. In Nassau, the two cars were brought over from FAV at the time, and they didn't do very well. And so it was kind of embarrassing because it was the first time on the North American region, not the Bahamas is on the continent, but they had a lot of Ford executives that took a holiday and went down to the Bahamas to see the race, and they were kind of embarrassed. So at the end of it all, Roy kind of made a summary, and this is page 4, and he said, I think we ought to look at, when I looked at the power with the Chaparrals and the Ferraris and the Corvette Grand Sports and all that's happening here, I'm worried that we're going to run out of power with the small block. So he says, we got to look at how we can increase power, and we've got to, like Eric Broadley said, decrease the weight. So after Nassau, Roy went back to Dearborn, and he started with a partnership with Carcraft, and they started to work out of a Haggerty Street, and they ordered 2 chassis, 106 and 107. We're lighter weight, same chassis, but they used thinner metal, and in the where the gas tanks are, the sponsons were perforated metal. So those were the 2 cars that they took to Le Mans. X1 was a hybrid that had steel in the front and in the back, but aluminum in the middle. And then the more power, the engineering and foundry division recommended the 427 motor, which is the next slide.
What happened to the 2 cars that ran it?
At 65?
No, 64.
Well, they ended up going to Shelby.
Right.
Yeah, so that's the other thing. Wire, you built 50, Shelby, you raced them, and then Roy went back for the next year's version. So 3 things were happening at one time.
And by the way, I was at Shelby when those 2 cars were riding from Nassau. And I mean to tell you, Phil Remington worked magic with those cars. I mean, off came the wire wheels, on came on the Halbrand mags. They lightened it up tremendously, and ended up in the first race was at Daytona. And guess what? Ford won his first race at Daytona under Shelby's team, and then again at Sebring.
And this is in a matter of literally weeks. They took a car that not only hadn't won, it hadn't finished a race in all of 1964, and they came back and they won the very first time out. And it was just a bunch of hot ride guys in Southern California.
And in the fall of 64, early 65, the Colati Transaxle was upgraded with 4 gears. So it had the magnesium cases from Colati, but it had 4 gears on the inside, and that helped a lot. So back to this story, they're trying to go to the next year. They took the 427 motor, and then they designed a Transaxle, which is on the next slide there. Ed Hull is a hero of mine. He was the guy that designed this chassis and was the project manager for that. John Mullen was the first mechanic at Carcraft, and they originally were going to do automatic transmissions for the 427 car. And the whole 65 building of the Mark IIs was really kind of like what they were doing with Lola with the mules. They were taking a GT40 chassis and they threw a Transaxle in it, they threw a 427 motor in it. And they really didn't plan on racing it all, but McLaren was at the, if you go to the next slide, I think there's at the Ford Proving Ground, McLaren and later on Ken Miles drove it up there, and they both said, this is a fabulous car. I mean, you could just start out in third gear almost. It's got such a broad band. So they said, well, heck, okay, let's build 2 of them. And they took 2 of them over to LeMans. Next slide. These are guys that are gone, but not forgotten. Teenage Gordon Chance on the left there, Alan. And John Mullerin is the guy I was telling you about that was the forged mechanic. He built the Mark IIs. Phil Remington, and then Bruce McLaren was driving. So when they started the race at the end of the first lap, look at the 3rd place car.
Oh my gosh.
That's after lap 1. It was just amazing. These cars were so fast and and they were not working hard at it. And so they knew that they were onto something. Unfortunately, they both failed the minor transmission problems. But again, this was a mule to try to get for the next year. So in '66, Ford embarked on this is when Henry Ford basically said to Iacocca and Fry, and they went in and they said, well, we blew it at 65. We think we need to just invest more time and effort in this. We're going to do the same program we did with Indianapolis. We're going to pull a team together, and we're going to work on it. They went down the hall, and they looked at each other, and they said, we didn't talk about budget. So they went back in, and they said, Mr. Ford, is there any kind of budget we need to go? And he said, I didn't mention any budget. I said, I want you to win. And that little card that's over there, if you go back one, that was given to Leo Beebe, who was a nice guy, not like the movie said. And he says, you better win. So they won Daytona, they won Sebring, and then they won Le Mans. And they were so proud of it, they got all the lights in the office to be won Le Mans. So 66 met it. In the meantime, while they were racing the Mark IIs, Roy Lund and Chuck Mountain were, and it was Chuck Mountain's idea to go to the Honeycomb Aluminum for the Mark IV. There are like no interchangeable parts between this car and this car except for the motor, transmission, and brakes. Completely new design. Even the spinners were different because they were designing the hubs for a lighter car. These have heavier hubs, so they didn't want the spinners to get in the wrong car. But it's a totally aluminum chassis. I don't know if you can go back one, William. It started out as the J car. There's a lot of people that say that thing, see the little front things, they called them the clam diggers? But Ed Hull told me, he said, no, I was worried about overheating because all the other cars had overheating problems. So he had a big radiator opening. But what he was trying to do was have the side of the body come down to the very front, like the Can-Am cars did in 69, 70, and stuff like that. So he was thinking ahead, but he made the mistake of trying to have too much cooling. So they were losing like 70 horsepower and just drag. So in the spring of 67, there's Chuck Mountain, Phil Remington, Homer Perry, and I don't know the other guy, in the wind tunnel where they turned the J car into the Mark IV. And in 2 months, they went to Sebring, they won 2 races, and then they were outlawed. Now, I just want to say here, the fellow that's on the back right with his arm like this, that's Phil Henney, and this is his box. And Phil, if you're watching today, it's in a good home for the future. So I think, what could have been. In 60, Ford thought that the rules would stay that the 427 could still be used in 68. So they were developing a whole new motor and the automatic transmission. That's a very interesting motor called the Calliope. It's 3 valves, 2 intake, 1 exhaust, but it's got 2 camshafts, one in its normal place, and that's operating both intakes. And then up in the valley where your lifters are, they put another cam in it. And they have horizontal push rods to do the exhaust. They put the biggest
BMW.
intakes, Hilborn fuel injection, the intakes were about the size of a Coke can. And they were getting 660 horsepower with 1/8 throttle opening.
Oh.
So they never really had a chance to develop that motor when the rules changed and Ford shut down the program. But they were planning for '69 to be running a double overhead cam. And it said that they were investigating a 3-liter double overhead cam V8 and a 5-liter double overhead cam V12. But we never got to see that because the program got shut down.
You might mention that Ken Miles got killed testing the J car a couple of months after Le
Right
Mans.
after Le Mans, yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of speculation as to what happened, but I have a copy of Ford's accident report, and it showed one of the CV joint balls was found on the ground right when he started to spin. And Carroll Smith's report said that he thought the differential locked up. So it seemed like something happened in the back end that got him to spin around. There was just no controlling it at that point, I guess.
Janos, can you wrap this up? We're running kind of late now, but just kind of tell us a little bit about the legacy of what all of this meant going forward from the Ford GT.
As Mike said, that there was a plan for '68, but really it kind of ended there, but not really. What happened at the end of '67, because what you had is you had 2 years of this tremendous Ford dominance, 66 and 67. And they were playing in France's backyard, the country France, not the personal France, in France's backyard. And the French were not too fond of that. Plus they had another agenda going on. The French at that point were building up their own, particularly aerospace industry, and saw that automobiles as an outlet to that as well. So there was a lot of French government money going into exotic automobile development in the form of the Matra. And they wanted to see the Matra win Le Mans, a French car to win Le Mans at least. And so as a result of that, the politics came into play, and the 7-liter engines that were used here, the 489s, were outlawed. Were outlawed basically overnight, but not really. The way the original rules for '68 onwards were to be that the cars were to be limited to 3 liters. They were prototypes at that point, so they no longer had to carry the spare tire and the luggage compartment that these cars have, because these cars are, this car in particular, the Mark II, is a sports car. It was labeled as a sports car. The GT40s, all the GT40s were labeled as sports cars because there were 50 of them built. That meant they had to carry road-going accoutrement like a luggage compartment and a spare tire. In '68, those rules were abandoned, went to only 3-liter prototypes, essentially mimicking Formula One cars of the era. They were to be full-body Formula One cars. But there was a problem with that. Nobody was building those at the time. There just weren't many of them around. So they thought, well, okay, we're going to grandfather in the existing smaller cars, not the 427s, but the 289s, up to, in other words, the 289s, 5 liters. So up to 5 liters, we'll grandfather cars in from that era as long as they built 50. And a few did make it in. The GT40, the Lola T70, 1 or 2 others. But, what were the proven cars? They were the GT40s. So the GT40s went on and won Le Mans again in '68, '69. '69, many people regard as one of the most thrilling Le Mans races of all. And then go on to another chapter, which of course would be a subject of another talk, is the Porsche 917, which was actually built to the 5-liter rule. And it was only 1972 before the 3 liters really kicked in. And that was the time of the Matras at Le Mans. As far as Ford goes, well, they still went on and had a great life. remember even earlier we had the GT versions of the Fords. What were the AC Bristol that Alan was talking about, which became the Cobra, which became the Cobra Coupe, which, believe it or not, is a GT car. It was based on the GT, the Grand Touring version of the Cobra. Those were still kind of lingering about. Then you had Ford with a kind of belated and not very successful Can-Am program, because that was one place where unlimited sports car racing could still exist. Ford didn't have a very successful time with it. They did have a very successful time with the Shelby GT350, the Mustang, basically the Shelby Mustangs. Had a good experience with that and in drag racing as well as sports car racing. But then Ford kind of went into the clips for a long time until just a few years ago, those cars that you see in the back of the room reappeared. Now we're running at Le Mans again in the 2000s and the 2010. And in 2016, the 50th anniversary of Ford's overall victory, a Ford GT did in fact win the GT class at Le Mans then. So the Ford legacy lives on in various forms.
Thank you, Janis, and thank you guys for a great presentation. We're going to have a couple of questions here. We're going to have to limit them a lot because we're running way over. But one of the first one that Salvatore from Little Ferry, New Jersey has asked here is, and I assume you mean, was this Mark I ever raced? And Benjamin, this Mark I was never raced, but the Mark I's, of which they made, how many? 40?
I'm not big.
Well, they made a lot.
Yeah.
And some were made as road cars originally, and even converted then to a race car, the 1049, which is the very first golf car.
Grady Davis.
Grady Davis's personal car was actually a road car that was converted into a race car and raced at Daytona and Sebring.
Phil Henney raced with Phil Panetti in '66 with 1040. There's a lot of Mark I racing.
Well, somebody didn't put their name on here, but it's actually an intriguing question. What do you think might have happened if Ford chose Lotus and Chapman instead of Lola and Brogan?
I guess number one, it would definitely have been a Lotus Ford, as it was in Indianapolis. I would think that Lotus, probably as you guys said, Lotus would not have happened because of that, because Ford would not let Lotus be the name in front. But they would meet their match in Colin Chapman, I think, unlike Eric Broadley. Eric Broadley's big problem was he just didn't like corporate politics. That wasn't just Roy Lund, but he didn't like dealing with a large corporation. I think Chapman would have been a tougher nut to crack.
Yeah, I think that they knew when they had the interview. Roy told me that Colin had taken it upon himself to show an artist's concept of what he feels like the car should be. So, and also, Colin said, you can buy the Lotus factory if you want to. So they left that meeting with, this guy's boisterous. Roy Lund had problems with Broadley, but it took about 6 months for them to come to loggerheads. I think that Colin and Eric and Lund would have had a problem from probably day one.
Alan, here's a question for you. Graham Scott, who's come all the way from Toledo, Ohio today. Why did the drivers change, especially Richie Ginther, Maston Gregory, both led Le Mans in 1964, but they did not remain as drivers? Can you comment on what the deal was with drivers and why they rotated out so much within the Ford GT program over a number of years?
Yes, when drivers were selected, like for example, Shelby, when we were running the Daytona Coupes, Shelby knew me, knew my ability. And so basically he put me in a Daytona Coupe and we won the world championship. But the next year, in '66, Shelby came to me and says, Alan, he says, I got to tell you right now, Ford's going to select the drivers, and I'll have a little input, but not any. But they're looking for world famous race car drivers, and your chances of being able to drive are slim and none. And so that's when I decided to go back to college.
I want to conclude with this last question, and I think more than a few people are here, and a lot of the interest in these cars is here because of that recent movie, Ford v Ferrari, and one of the high points of that movie brings out the controversy of the finish of 1966 at Le Mans. And Mike and Alan, I'd like you to comment about the controversy about that finish. I mean, who really won Le Mans and why?
You want me to start out? Okay,
Yeah.
so there's two ways to answer that. There's morally and technically. And what everybody that just laughed might not know is morally wasn't more about Ken Miles, it was about Bruce McLaren. Let me go to the technical one first. The rules at Le Mans at that time said that the car that's in the lead at the end of 24 hours is the winner. To the nanosecond. So, unless you cross the finish line at exactly 24 hours, the end of the race happens somewhere else. And so they have a clause in there that says if two cars are tied as they go across the lap, the finish line, but the 24 hours is going to happen before they get back, then they calculate who's the winner based on the average lap time and the distance that they carried.
Now, when you say it's actually if they cross the finish line at exactly the same thing on the penultimate lap, right?
Well, okay, but yeah, the only way you could have the penultimate lap is the one before the finish. So in the case of '66, Ken Miles and Bruce McLaren, per the IBM charts, and I have copies of Carroll Smith's lap charts, I have the ACO's handwritten lap charts, I have copies of the IBM readouts. We put them all into an Excel spreadsheet, and unlike the rumors, there is no missing lap. There is no missing lap. And the two, McLaren and Miles, there's a radio interview where he said he was looking right at Miles and they crossed he said, what people don't know is that the IBM stripe is before the finish line. And so in the penultimate lap, they were together and they crossed the finish line per the IBM records at the same, not only hour, minute, and second, but to the 10th of a second. They were exactly the same, to the 10th of a second. So somewhere out on Anage, or somewhere out on the Mulsanne Straight, the 24 hours was over. But because the lap before the finish that we all think about, they crossed at exactly the same time, the rules state, well then who traveled the greatest distance? Within 10 meters. So because McLaren was farther back in the lineup, he had obviously traveled further than Miles had. Therefore, in the 24 hours, he had traveled further and he was the winner. Now, that's the technical side. Morally, McLaren was in the lead for many hours. And on the last lap, when he pulled in, the Goodyear guy came over and looked at the left rear and said, change this tire. And didn't think much about it, but then he goes, why? He didn't even look at it. Well, that put him behind Miles. So in between those pit stops, Miles was ahead. So McLaren wrote a letter to his dad saying, oh, I was getting cheated out of the win. And so he went to BB and he said, you know, I could get back out there and I could go right past Miles. I was doing it all the whole day. I was behind a lot and I caught up and I passed him. You don't want that. I think you should have a photo finish. So it was McLaren that suggested the photo finish. And technically they crossed at the same time. So it's an interesting one. Who is morally the one that lost the race?
Well, just to clarify, and Mike is right, basically, that there is these differences between the technical and the moral. And just to clarify what he means by that 15 meter, 10 meter, and we were in the last couple of days, he and I and a group of us were debating what the exact distance is. You have to look it up. But in those days, up through 1969, the way the start went at Le Mans, what's called the Le Mans Start, that the cars were lined up in an echelon formation next to each other, and the drivers were across the track, and at the signal at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, the signal was given. They ran across the track, jumped into the car, and took off. So the car furthest to the front, which was the fastest. By 66, they went with the fastest qualifier. Previous years it was by displacement, but in 66 it was the fastest qualifier. It was first in that echelon. They in effect traveled the least amount of total distance. So if you add up all the laps and all the time, so from the moment the race started at 4 o'clock until 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, the car, assuming that they traveled the same number of laps, which of course most cars don't, but there were these two cars that traveled the exact same number of laps. That's a given. But they started a couple positions away from each other, and there's a specific number of meters how far apart they are. So when you factor in that difference of where the car started, that's what makes a difference in the total distance traveled. Needless to say, this is a fiendishly detailed and complicated rule, which fortunately was dropped. And ever since then, and actually not ever since then, there were a couple of variations since then. But today, when you see the start of the Le Mans, which is now done in a rolling start like most races, it's no longer taken into fact. If a car from way back ends up with the same number of laps as a car that started first, they don't account for that difference anymore. It's just, but the other difference now is that the race ends when the car finishes the lap after the 24 hours have expired, not at the moment that the 24 hours expired, as Mike was explaining. That's the big difference.
And the interesting thing is the flag drop that we all talk about. Oh, McLaren squirted ahead. Oh, Ken Miles slowed down. That really didn't have anything to do with the race. The flag drop was just a show.
Yeah, so, well, thank you. I had to ask it. I'm sorry that I got into it. David Winter, can we get you and Rob and Bob Ida, can you guys start moving your cars out back for our demo?
This is Pam from NortheastWheelsEvents.com at Simeone Foundation Museum in Philadelphia at the birth of the Ford GT.
So again, thank you all for coming today, and just